Your kids could get free or low-cost health coverage from Medicaid or CHIP. Even if you've applied before, they may be eligible now. Kids up to age 19 are covered for checkups, vaccines, dentist visits, hospital care, and more. And if they already have Medicaid or CHIP, remember to renew every year. Visit insurekidsnow.gov or call 877-KIDS-NOW. Paid for by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services.
こんにちは、皆さん。
Good day, everyone.
今日はHagakureについて
Today, I'm going to talk about the Hagakure.
それで1700
This was a short book,
初めて出版された
first published in the early 1700s.
侍のように振る舞うための
It
ハンドブック
became
なん
a
て
kind of
なってるん
handbook
だ
for how to behave like a samurai.
そんなことは人殺しのマニュアルと
You
思う
might
か
think
も
this
し
sounds
れ
like
な
a
いね。
manual for murder.
しかしこの元が手動と高潔な行為に
But I was
焦点を
surprised
当
to
てている
find
ことに
that this book
驚いた
focuses
な。
on noble behavior and
それ
leadership.
で日本語で話してみるつもりだ。
In today's episode, I'll be speaking a lot of Japanese.
英語と古代ギリシャ語
And
し
you
か
just thought I
話せない
spoke
と
ancient
思った
Greek?
かい？お前たちまだ我々の力理解できないよ。
You have yet to comprehend my power.
Okay, that last part was just a little bit of anime-style Japanese. And anime-style Japanese tends to be rude, extreme. It uses a bizarre literary type of phrasing that doesn't even sound natural in Japanese. There's an element of anime-style Japanese that's very hard to get across in English because it uses very rude, very old, feudal, lordly speak. So it just sounds really badass and epic in Japanese. And a lot of times to get across this intensity or condescension, the translators will just add profanity to the subtitles, where there was actually no profanity in the Japanese. It was just, the sentence just had such an ugly tone based on the grammar and word choice in Japanese. And as an example, in my anime-style ending to my introduction there, I referred to you guys as omaetachi, which sometimes I've seen in anime subtitles would have been translated, hey, you assholes. So it's, but that's not what it means. It just means you, plural you. Hey, you guys. It's strange that when I first studied Japanese, it was all about Akira Kurosawa and samurai movies, and anime was just now taking shape in the form that it has now. Obviously, in the 60s and 70s, you had the Speed Racer cartoons, things like that. But with Neon Genesis Evangelion and Akira, and then some of the other formative anime in the 90s, they're the ones that sort of set the stage for what anime is now. And it's extremely influential with Gen Z. So, as we move into Japanese, we have now moved out of the very specific and structured ancient Greek language to Japanese, which is the exact opposite. It's a very right-brained and social and intuitive language. And one way to describe that would be to say that it's a vague language. I watched a little bit of a Japanese TV series where there was this guy who was hired by he was sort of a superhero PR guy because he was famous for being able to speak for, 45 minutes without actually saying anything useful or constructive or specific. We have people that can do that in English, but it's a lot harder. So give them credit. And the very title, Hagakure, is another good example of what I'm talking about. Hagakure is very difficult to translate. It's simply a pairing of two Chinese characters. It's the native Japanese pronunciation of those two Chinese characters. And one character means leaf, and the other character means hidden. So leaf hidden, hidden by leaves, obscured by fallen leaves. It's a poetic phrasing, and it's thought to reflect the fact that this is forgotten knowledge, or that when the authors were compiling this, they could see that the era of the samurai was closing, and that what was this sort of energetic and important social class was now becoming a thing of myth. something that you would make cool movies about, but that's about it. Now, the relationship between Japanese and Chinese is complex, and that's the understatement of the century. The main thing to remember is that Japanese and Chinese are not even in the same language family. So bear in mind, Chinese is much more like English than it is like Japanese. It's a strange fact, but it's absolutely true. Chinese has extremely difficult sounds for English speakers. It's very difficult for a native English speaker to learn to speak Chinese extremely well. But it's really a morphological, neurological issue having to do with new consonants and tones and that sort of thing. But the grammar is not that difficult. Now, Japanese is a little bit the reverse. Japanese is only sort of semi-tonal. You can get away with ignoring tones in Japanese. I don't, because to sound native, you have to pay attention to that. And I had to suffer through all the tones with Chinese, so why not just, bring some of that into Japanese? But the main thing is to just go fast, keep your syllables an even length. The sounds are fairly simple compared to other foreign languages for an English speaker. Now, the problem with Japanese is that the grammar is bizarre and backwards. That's the best way to put it. And that there's all these social and intuitive and emotional tags that you have to add to your speech. And note that this means that Chinese speakers also find Japanese to be bizarre and backwards. We think that just because China is so much closer to Japan that there's some sort of connection there. Well, no, there's not. And in fact, it seems that in this case, between these two cultures, familiarity has only bred contempt over time. And what's odd is it seems to be getting worse. I've seen YouTube videos about young Chinese and young Japanese becoming quite hostile toward the opposite country. Okay, so the original pronunciation of the character that represents the ha in Hagakure is yeah in Chinese. Normally they add a little z at the end, and it's this other little character that I remember because it looks like a baby, a swaddled baby, and you add that after little things. So in Chinese, child is not hai, it's haizi, because that zi means it's, this little cute thing. And a leaf is not ye, it's yezi. And then chopsticks are kuaizi. So anytime you hear a zi at the end of a word in Chinese, it usually means some little individual thing. Anyway, but in Japanese, a leaf is just ha, like H-A. So the next character in Chinese is yin. You would spell that in pinyin, Y-I-N, and it's the third tone, which is the low tone, so yin. And that means hidden, obscured. So a Chinese person would see those two characters and they'd say, oh, ye yin, which means leaf hidden. Hidden leaves hidden by what? They would be sort of confused because Chinese is much more straightforward. It doesn't give you weird hints as a title. So, hidden by the leaves, hidden under leaves, obscured by leaves. Sometimes the title was expanded to Hagakure Kikigaki. Kikigaki. Now, Kikigaki is things that were heard and written down. Hagakure is also known as the Book of the Samurai. I can see why that title took over because it actually tells you what the thing is about. It is a spiritual guide for a warrior. It's a collection of sayings and maxims and bits of wisdom that had been handed down in the samurai class over time. By the late 1700s, I think a lot of historians would say that the samurai class had become a bloated shadow of its former self. And then, of course, by the Meiji era in the late 19th century, Japan forcefully modernized itself, and the attitude and lifestyle of the samurai was problematic in some ways, but also useful to the imperial government. A lot of people are responsible for the material that we're going to read. So the fascinating thing about the Hagakure is that it clearly is an echo of an extremely violent and chaotic period in history. Japan is a small place. It's been a fairly densely populated place for most of its history. It's this sort of skinny series of islands that roughly have the latitude from Maine to Florida. So you have a wide variety of climates and landscapes. So Japan became a kind of pressure cooker of war. And over 400 years of intense violence, it produced a very bizarre society. And then once the shogun and the emperor began to maintain these long periods of peace, well, then the samurai class was not as useful as it was before. So what we're already seeing in the Hagakure is nostalgia, a reverence for a warlike past that made people harder, sharper, stronger, and now everything's sort of getting soft. Now, because of that idea, and because of its reverence for a warlike past, in Imperial Japan in the early 20th century, especially during World War II, the Hagakure was revived as a kind of imperial propaganda. And as we get into the Hagakure's insistence that a warrior is always prepared for death and thinks of himself as a dead person already, it's an extreme and grim view of life that I think the imperial government found useful, especially if you were trying to convince people to constantly conduct suicidal attacks on their enemies. And remember, what we call kamikaze attacks is a very old thing in Japan. There was a legend that a fleet of warships were about to invade Japan and a storm came along and destroyed them. Which, by the way, a similar thing happened with the Spanish Armada in 1588 when Spain was trying to bully and or invade England. There was an unusual storm that divided the fleet and allowed for some strategery on the part of Queen Elizabeth. Now, a similar thing happened, and the Japanese began to refer to that storm as the divine wind, or the wind of God. Kami is God in Japanese, and it can be singular or plural, because, like any good vague language, there's no plural in Japanese, really. There are roundabout ways to specify the number of things that you're talking about, but in general, you have to just get it from context. See what I mean? Now, Kami is God, Kaze is a wind. Kamikaze is divine wind, or God storm, if you want to stretch it a little bit. Moving on to the actual Hagakure text, one thing you'll find out immediately is something that I liked about this is it's not what Western people might suspect. Based on what I just said about the history of it and what it talks about and the purpose that it was used for, you might think, well, this is all about just obey orders, swing your sword properly. This is about how to properly challenge another man to a duel. After all, this is a brutal warlike regime, right? A closed, controlled society. And so, of course, as we're about to see, a big part of learning how to be a proper samurai is learning how to give appropriate negative feedback to subordinates or friends. You carry weapons with you everywhere, and you have the right to behead people under certain conditions, but remember to always be polite and that there is a structure for how you're supposed to call out faults in your friends or subordinates. Let's hear.
To give a person an opinion, one must first judge well whether that person is of the disposition to receive it or not. One must become close with him and make sure that he continually trusts your word. When you must approach sensitive topics, seek the best way to speak and to be well understood. Judge the occasion and determine whether it is better to do it by way of a letter or to say it at the time of leave-taking. Praise his good points and use every device to encourage him. Perhaps by talking about one's own faults without touching on his, but in a way so that they will occur to him. Have him receive this in the way that a man would drink water when his throat is dry, and it will be an opinion that will correct faults.
Samurai is just an old word that means retainer or servant. Now, the word had a very broad scope. So this could be a bodyguard, someone pledged to fight for you in war. It could also just mean a messenger, an official courier of messages, someone you trusted to be your designee in negotiations or communication. In practical terms, we can see something we see in Roman history, where a culture sort of realizes that conquest is easy, but long-term peaceful rule is not. So the samurai became politicians as well as warriors. They simply were politicians who lived on the bloody edge of the politics of their time. And so they understood that while conquest required the tactical knowledge about weapons and how to train horses, how to make the best armor, that sort of thing, they knew that once the conquest occurred, all of that was completely useless and just a huge waste of blood without good statesmanship and good leadership over the common people. So, civility, paperwork, demonstrations of power became part of what the samurai worked at. I think the history of Japan is extremely instructive because of this bizarre contradiction or inversion in which a country that is a chaotic pressure cooker of violence, completely closed off culturally from the rest of the world, produces a very ordered and extremely polite society. And maybe that's the result of a culture that becomes obsessed with producing quote-unquote swords. We call them swords, but katana were essentially 3-foot-long straight razors that were strong enough to survive a strong impact. I think the katana sums up a lot of feudal Japan. The aesthetic is clearly something that is seeking the impression of cleanliness, clarity, sobriety, elegance, in the sense of being sparing or choosy in the artistic elements that you allow on board. And as we all know, there's a minimalist element in Japanese architecture and food that focuses on just finding the best quality ingredients and putting them together in a skillful way. Because this book focuses on what the Japanese call Bushido, the warrior code of the samurai, we should talk about what that word means and where it comes from. Now, the way to say warrior in Chinese is 武士, 武士. And the Chinese word for a way or a path, either physical or metaphorical, is dao, dao. So, 武士道 would be the way of the warrior. The Japanese borrowed a huge amount of words from Chinese. It's similar to how English has so many Latin words in it, even though our language doesn't work anything like Latin. Imagine a language that's more different than Latin and English, but somehow you got a bunch of words in there, and they have to somehow fit your completely different way of pronouncing things and your completely different way of using words, because there are things you have to do to Japanese words that you don't have to do to Chinese words. Similar to Latin. Now, the Japanese have 2 ways to read any character. You have to learn 2,500 of these to be able to graduate a Japanese high school. And the problem is, unlike in Chinese, where it's generally one character, one word, one meaning, not always, but most of the time, once you learn how to pronounce a character in Chinese and what it means, you're kind of done. Not so in Japanese. In Japanese, some characters have 7 different ways to read them. Completely different sounds they make based on where they fall in a word. And in general, there are 2 kinds of readings. There's what's called the on reading. The on reading generally relates back to the original pronunciation of the character in Chinese. And then the kun pronunciation is the native Japanese way of saying it. And so, remember in Chinese, the word for hidden is yin, yin. But in Japanese, to hide something or to hide oneself would be, or to hide something is kakureru, kakureru. And that ru is the verbal ending, so to make it a noun, kind of like adding ing to an English verb, you take the ru off, and it's just kakure. So Hagakure is the sort of vague image or suggestion that we talked about earlier. So, 武士道 became Bushido in Japanese. It's written with the same 3 characters, but depending on where you are, it's pronounced completely differently. Now, we also talk about the emperor and the shogun. Everyone's heard that word. Shogun comes from the Chinese word for a military general. guy who's in charge of an army. And those two characters that the Japanese would pronounce shogun, the Chinese would pronounce jiangjun, a little different, but jun or gun means army. So there we go, a little bit of a introduction to the complications of the collision between Japanese and Chinese culture over the last few thousand years. So moving on.
There was once a man who said, such and such a person has a violent disposition. But this is what I said right to his face. This was an unbecoming thing to say. And it was said simply because he wanted to be known as a rough fellow. It was rather low. And it can be seen that he was still rather immature. A samurai is admired because he has correct manners. Speaking of other people in this way is no different from an exchange between low-class spearmen. It is vulgar.
And here we see more of the obsession with elegance and politeness, and elegance in the old sense of being sparing and not extravagant, not baroque. We kind of have gone off on a bunny trail with the word elegance, and it doesn't quite mean what it should anymore, because when people think of elegant now, they think of accessorized to the gills, but it really means the opposite. And this passage touches on a pattern, a difference that I've noticed between Eastern and Western civilization. And it has to do with that word, civilization, and what it means to people. In the West, civilization essentially means being citified. It means living in cities, being part of a culture that builds cities. Now, you may not live in the city. In fact, the leaders of Western civilization very often lived outside cities on large estates or plantations. And so very often the city, the core of the city, was not the best place to be. But that is definitely where your press gangs found the crews for your ships and your common soldiers, or your silver miners, or your roving bands of migrant workers during harvest season. So you had to have a high population. So civilization does not come directly from a Latin word that the Romans used in that same sense. It appears to be a medieval development, but it does come from the Latin word civilis, which could mean civil. Civil in the sense of things that pertain to the citizen of a city, something political, public, or even something related to being courteous or polite, as in the way citizens should behave with one another, or doing things in the way of a lawful member of a city-state. So, traditionally, in the West, civilization was based on building cities and having people behave in a way that allowed for peaceful conduct of business in a heavily populated city. Being civil citizens and civilians inside a civilization had a lot to do with living in cities. Civilization in Japanese is bunka. Bunka. You would spell that B-U-N-K-A. Now, just like English got its word for civilization ultimately from Latin, and they write it in a way that would be familiar to Romans, but they don't say it in a way that would be familiar. In the same way, the Japanese got that word, bunka, ultimately from Chinese. The Chinese word for civilization is wenhua, wenhua. And you spell it with the exact same characters. You write it the same way. But as you can see, very different pronunciation. Now, the first character, wen, means writings or documents, literature, letters. It's a catch-all. That's a character that pops up in the Chinese word for registration or essay, that kind of thing. And then that second character, hua, means change or transformation. A lot of times you'll see that character at the end of words, and it has the same meaning or the same role as the suffix ization in English. So you can see why I like to think of this word as meaning litericization, which is not a real word, as indicated by the chime, but litericization is really the way the Chinese conceived of civilization. They did think that their writing system and their imperial administrative form of government that was based heavily on written reports and training armies of bureaucrats to manage the rice harvest and dams and military conscriptions and things like that. They considered that as the core function of civilization. Writing stuff down, having a history, having functionaries of the government. That was civilization, not cities. So you can see that in a lot of Confucian thought, and even here in the Hagakure, meaning it was thought to be very important that the samurai maintain a certain set of ideals and exhibit certain kinds of behavior to the common people. They thought that that was the basis of a good civilization, not, as the Romans did, roads that didn't form mud puddles or things like that. That was what the Romans tended to focus on. Or in previous episodes, we talked about how the Romans focused on soil erosion or dredging harbors to make them more accessible to certain kinds of naval traffic. That's what they were interested in. Oh, and of course, famously, water supply, building aqueducts. The Romans knew that access to fresh drinking water was the basis of building new cities. And of course, for them, civilization was about cities. It wasn't about developing certain kinds of behavior. I think this is a pattern that is pretty noticeable. Anyway, moving on.
Among the maxims on Lord Naoshige's wall, there was this one. Matters of great concern should be treated lightly. Master Ite commented, matters of small concern should be treated seriously. Among one's affairs, there should not be more than 2 or 3 matters of what one could call great concern. If these are deliberated upon during ordinary times, they can be understood. Thinking about things ahead of time, and then handling them lightly when the time comes, is what this is all about. To face an event and solve it lightly is difficult if you are not resolved beforehand, and there will always be uncertainty in hitting your mark. However, if the foundation is laid previously, you can think of the saying, matters of great concern should be treated lightly, as your own basis for action.
This section points to one of the more fundamental virtues of the samurai, planning and preparation. So everything was supposed to be honed to pure muscle memory and reflex. The idea in all of the martial arts, both Japanese and Chinese, is that you don't strategize during a fight. There's no time to think. There's an idea in the military that when things go bad, people don't rise to the occasion. They fall back on their training. So that training and preparation, the muscle memory, the reflex, that's what's important in a fight. And we know Mike Tyson famously said, and this is one of my quotes that I live by, he says, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And that's when your plan goes out the window, or out of your mouth, along with your teeth. There's another military maxim that says, no battle plan survives the first shot. That concept is similar to Mr. Tyson's. One thing I've found is that planning helps you improvise better. Since you know going into a fight, or a big project, or into some sort of chaotic management situation, you have to be able to improvise. You got to be a jazz player. So when you plan something, it forces you to consider all of the assets and the liabilities. You learn the map of the battlefield, so to speak. Sun Tzu talks about that a lot. Or Sun Tzu. We'll eventually do an episode about him. So in other words, you plan so that you can play jazz when the actual event happens. That's why jazz musicians play sheet music all the time and practice scales, because it helps them improvise. So I think that's what he's getting at this point. The idea that if you've already done the planning and the preparation, then these matters of great concern can be treated lightly because you don't have to go back and rethink everything and restructure a response. You already have everything. You have all the notes practiced and laid out that you can play, and you can switch keys with ease. So, moving on.
A certain swordsman, in his declining years, said the following: "In one's life, there are levels in the pursuit of study. At the lowest level, a person studies, but nothing comes of it, and he feels that both he and others are unskillful. At this point, he is worthless. At the middle level, he is still useless, but he is aware of his own insufficiencies, and he can also see the insufficiencies of others. At a higher level, he has pride concerning his own ability, and he rejoices in the praise from others, and he laments the lack of ability in his fellows. This man has worth. At the highest level, a man knows that he knows nothing. These are the levels, but there is one transcending level, and this is the most excellent of all. This person is aware of the endlessness of entering deeply into a certain way, and he never thinks of himself as having finished. He truly knows his own insufficiencies, and never in his whole life thinks that he has succeeded. He has no thoughts of pride, but with self-abasement, he knows the way to the end. It is said that Master Yagyu once remarked, 'I do not know the way to defeat others, only the way to defeat myself.'"
There are many passages like this in the Hagakure, and you'll see this kind of focus in Japanese culture overall. It's the focus on developing the competence and skill of the next generation. In the West, we often look at the education systems in the Far East, the Chinese school system, South Korea, Japan, and we note some of the extremities in what parents will go through and the pressure that's put on young people. And this is well into the 21st century now. It does have deep roots that goes back thousands of years in the Far East. There's an idea that this difference comes from huge differences in how you cultivate rice versus wheat. A culture based on rice cultivation will be more focused on education and skill, even among the lower classes. Whereas wheat cultivation, pre-modern wheat cultivation, is kind of just a crapshoot where what you need is luck and a huge amount of labor. Just raw brute force. And land. In pre-modern agriculture, there was no way to intensify wheat production. So if you had 1,000 people working 1 acre, you weren't going to get any more wheat out of that acre. If you sent those 1,000 people to medieval agriculture school, they still weren't going to produce much more. Rice would be very different. The number of people you have working on an acre of rice matters a lot. That will definitely produce more rice, and better skill and coordination among the rice farmers will produce even more rice. And so you can see, for economic reasons, the relationship between the nobility and the peasantry and skill and education is quite different. Master Yagyu's remark about not knowing the way to defeat others, but only knowing the way to defeat oneself, I don't think is a direct callback or allusion to Confucius, but there is a definite reflection of the Confucian idea. Confucius did say, "He who conquers himself is the mightiest warrior." Now let's move on to an especially long quote, but I think it's important because it goes into detail about what a samurai's daily life was supposed to be like. So let's listen.
Every morning, the samurai of 50 or 60 years ago would bathe, shave their foreheads, put lotion in their hair, cut their fingernails and toenails, rubbing them with pumice and then with wood sorrel, and without fail, pay attention to their personal appearance. It goes without saying that their armor in general was kept free from rust, that it was dusted, shined, and arranged. Although it seems that taking special care of one's appearance is similar to showiness, it is nothing akin to elegance. Even if you are aware that you may be struck down today and are firmly resolved to an inevitable death, if you are slain with an unseemly appearance, you will show your lack of previous resolve. You will be despised by your enemy, and you will appear unclean. For this reason, it is said that both old and young should take care of their appearance. Although you say that this is troublesome and time-consuming, a samurai's work is in such things. It is neither busy work nor time-consuming. In constantly hardening one's resolution to die in battle, deliberately becoming as one already dead, and working at one's job and dealing with military affairs, there should be no shame. But when the time comes, a person will be shamed if he is not conscious of these things even in his dreams, and rather passes his days in self-interest and self-indulgence. And if he thinks that this is not shameful and feels that nothing else matters as long as he is comfortable, then his dissipate and discourteous actions will be repeatedly regrettable. The person without previous resolution to an inevitable death makes certain that his death will be in bad form. But if one is resolved to death beforehand, in what way can he be despicable? One should be especially diligent in this concern. Furthermore, customs have changed in the last 30 years. Now, when young samurai get together, if there is not just talk about money affairs, loss and gain, secrets, clothing styles, or matters of sex, there is no reason to gather at all. Customs are going to pieces. One can say that, formerly, when a man reached the age of 20 or 30, he did not carry despicable things in his heart, and thus neither did such words appear. If an elder unwittingly said something of that sort, he thought of it as a sort of injury. This new custom probably appears because people attach importance to being beautiful before society and to household finances. What things a person can accomplish if he has no haughtiness concerning his place in society? It is a wretched thing that the young men of today are so contriving and so proud of their material possessions. Men with contriving hearts are lacking in duty, and if they are lacking in duty, they will have no self-respect.
This advice reminds me of that old adage about always wearing clean underwear in case you get into a car accident or something, so you don't get embarrassed at the emergency room when they cut your blue jeans off and you have dirty underwear on. Now, in their case, there was some practicality in this idea. If I were a military leader and I saw that my enemies were always well equipped and clean and well groomed, I would have a higher regard for them. I would estimate their level of discipline as being better, and therefore I would judge them as a more formidable enemy. Also, note that the bizarre hairstyles that you see among samurai had a practical purpose. Remember that the archipelago of Japan spans a broad range of latitudes, so in Hokkaido it can get extremely cold. In the southern regions of Japan, Okinawa for example, it can get extremely hot and humid. And so when you look at how the samurai helmets fit on the head and how they were secured, you can see that the way that the samurai shaved and shaped their hair made it so that the helmet fit naturally on their head and moved around less, and, very importantly, allowed for airflow under the helmet and prevented heat stroke. So, those guys did not look like that because they thought it looked cool. It was to keep their brains cool, to allow for them to keep fighting through summer days without dropping dead. All that armor wasn't very light or comfortable, and you had to have armor over every square inch of your body when you're fighting people with 3-foot straight razors. Also bear in mind that the katana was not the primary weapon of the samurai. You had polearm devices, spears, and arrows were also extremely important. So samurai fights did not involve masses of men lining up and swinging katana around on a battlefield. Apparently, one of the better graphic depictions of feudal Japanese warfare would be, of course, Akira Kurosawa's Ran from 1986, one of his later films. You don't see a lot of katanas during those battles. They were almost like the pistol that officers wore on their belt. It was not the main weapon on the battlefield. Why did the development of swordsmanship go in such a different direction in Japan? It went in a direction that was different even from China. When you look at Chinese swords, Dao, that's how you say sword in Chinese. Now, remember, Dao is a way or a path, but Dao is a sword or a knife. Two totally different words. And so the Chinese Dao were long, heavy, squared off swords, very similar to what you see in Europe and in the West. Now, there's a good reason for that, and it's because of how Japan came to exist in the first place. Long story short, without getting too much into geology, volcanism, and plate tectonics, let's just say that for land formation reasons, Japan has terrible iron deposits. It's very hard, even today in Japan, to find good quality iron. So there isn't a lot of iron, period. And the iron you do find has more impurities per gram than deposits elsewhere in Europe or Asia, for example. Now, once again, this has to do with the fact that Japan is a recent arrival. It's a product of the Pacific Rim's volcanic and seismic activity, which we saw a little bit of that recently with the huge earthquake in Far East Russia, which is right along the Pacific Rim. And so Japan did culturally what it always does, and why I admire Japanese culture. So because they had very little iron, and the iron they had wasn't very good, they did two things. They developed weapons and methods of war that used very little iron and used it to its fullest extent, i.e. holding edges. And then number two, they developed a very, very labor-intensive and painstaking method of purifying iron. And so they ended up with these extremely sharp, very high-quality swords, but it was the result of an insane amount of labor and technique development and investment over time to create this. So the katana really is a good example of Japanese culture's adaptability and how they're entirely willing to use an insane amount of effort and time investment to achieve something. So meanwhile, in Europe, and to some extent in China, where iron was plentiful, and there were some iron deposits that were just very good, just almost pure iron right out of the ground. So you could make these gigantic swords that you see in Western civilization. And they didn't even have to be very sharp because, A, their momentum was so extreme that even a dull edge could take off a limb. And B, if you're fighting someone in plate armor, which you did a lot in Europe because iron was cheap, so why not make a suit of armor? And so a good blow to the helmet could knock someone off their feet or knock them dizzy, even without cutting them. And so in Europe, you end up with these weapons that are, they're swords, but they also kind of double as iron bats. That's how much iron they had. Meanwhile, in Japan, they developed a blade that was so rigid and so well balanced and so sharp that it could take someone's arm or head off with shockingly little effort. Another thing to mention is that this dusting and cleaning of the equipment has a very practical purpose, similar to the hair shaving. And that's because whether you're in Japan or Europe, whether you had a lot of iron or very little iron, one thing that was very difficult to do was to put enough carbon content in the iron to make steel. Steel is an iron-carbon alloy. A certain small amount of carbon in the iron will prevent it from rusting. It makes it more rigid, all this stuff. It's great. However, it requires a complex chemical process and an extreme amount of heat both of which were not available until the 19th century. So, when you see anything that is supposedly steel before the Industrial Revolution, just know that it's bad steel. It's very low carbon content steel. You did have areas where something like steel was being produced before the Industrial Revolution, but that very reliable stainless steel that we all have in our kitchens just did not exist anywhere. That's why people used silver a lot for their kitchenware. Everything rusted. Anything made of iron was going to develop at least some fine bit of rust on it eventually. And so, if you had a katana, if you had valuable purified iron materials, it was essential that you keep it dry and oiled at all times. And they would use a low acid oil, of course, something like linseed oil. It would create a barrier to keep oxygen and water vapor away from the iron. And so, once again, they're hammering home the idea that the best way to face death is through a lot of prior thought and preparation for death. And by thinking about death a lot and preparing for it, that leads to a better life. And I think that's the important thing that people forget. That they're saying, by acknowledging that you're going to die, and by envisioning that and figuring out why, what would you want to die for, that leads to a better lived life. One thing I do want to add here is when he says customs are going to pieces. I think to some extent every generation feels that way. However, and we'll do some episodes on this, we are in a unique period in human history. And so when Gen Xers talk about customs disappearing, and you can't classify it as just the old people angry that young people don't take seriously the same things they do. Our situation is more unique and extreme. But the last thing I'll say here is note that overall, respect and duty was always placed well above concerns for beauty, comfort, or happiness. The fundamental idea here is that respect and duty is more important than beauty, comfort, or happiness. And the one thing that's important for us to understand is, I think they're saying that if you live your life in a way that is focused on respect and duty, the beauty, comfort, and happiness will come along later. They're the byproducts of doing what you're supposed to do. However, if you ignore respect and duty and you take a shortcut and you go directly for trying to get beauty, comfort, and happiness, you might get a little bit of it at first, but it's all eventually going to fall apart. I think it's important for us because we tend to think that, well, if you're not aiming for beauty, comfort, or happiness, then, why are you even alive? What's the point? And I think the people who compiled the Hagakure would say, yeah, people have a tendency to make that mistake, but respect and duty comes first, or you're going to be miserable. So, moving on.
It is spiritless to think that you cannot attain that which you have seen and heard the masters attain. The masters are men. You are also a man. If you think that you will be inferior in doing something, you will be on that road very soon. Master Ite said, Confucius was a sage because he had the will to become a scholar when he was only 15 years old. He was not a sage because he studied as an old man. This is the same as the Buddhist maxim, first intention, then enlightenment.
Well, once again here we see the focus on seeing to the competence of the next generation. I also notice how this is an example of the pre-modern lack of the concept of childhood. Ancient people had a very different attitude about childhood than we do. Now, ideas about childhood and having this special time in a human's life early on where they should be allowed to, have certain kinds of development or make mistakes, that kind of thing. That does exist in the Far East now, of course, but it's new, just like it was new to the West. And also a little more limited. In Japanese culture, children are expected to be vastly more responsible and independent. For example, in Japanese schools, the children clean the school. Every day the classroom is dusted and arranged and swept and the windows are cleaned, and it's done by the children. It's done by the students. Good example of what I'm talking about. So, moving on.
In the words of the ancients, one should make his decisions within the space of 7 breaths. Lord Takanobu said, "If discrimination is long, it will spoil." Lord Naoshige said, "When matters are done leisurely, 7 out of 10 will turn out badly." A warrior is a person who does things quickly. When your mind is going hither and thither, discrimination will never be brought to a conclusion. With an intense, fresh, and unyielding spirit, one will make his judgments within the space of 7 breaths. It is a matter of being determined and having the spirit to break right through to the other side.
I did a little research on this, and it turns out that the average adult breathes 12 to 20 times per minute on average, according to the internet, and so that means it's true. Let's assume that this person's heart rate is a little bit elevated because of the sudden crisis that has come to their attention. Let's go with 20 breaths per minute, so 3 breaths per second. And according to my liberal arts mathematical genius, 7 breaths at 3 breaths per second works out to somewhere around 21 seconds. If you were to reframe this for a contemporary audience, you should say something like, one should make his decisions within the space of a YouTube ad. Okay, we will resume the Hagakure in our next volume to complete this little tour. I'll have more strange things about the Japanese language to talk about, maybe another introduction in Japanese, and I think you'll continue to be surprised at the gentility and thoughtfulness of what is supposed to be a guide for a warrior hell-bent on a good death. And I think that's a fascinating cultural insight. It's an expression of how Japanese culture had begun to see war as politics using other methods, to paraphrase a Western thinker. In other words, war is just another kind of politics, and politics are, to some extent, just verbal or financial attacks that are made instead of bullets and bombs. But the intent is the same. So the faction that conducts war well will win. The faction that conducts politics well will win. And the faction that conducts all its social and economic tasks in an orderly and efficient way will also win. And so the samurai were supposed to oversee a society where, yes, the peasant was supposed to dutifully weave the rice straw into a tatami mat with the exact right proportions and density. The shopkeeper keeps the front stairs of his shop perfectly dust-free, sweeping it every morning. And likewise, the samurai should be patiently polishing his armor for the same purpose. It's a vision of a very orderly society. And I think that's what they're wanting to transmit into the future. A way of life, a way of governing people. Now, we find some of this distasteful because it's obviously a culture that's built for total war. It's designed so that every farming peasant daughter still has dreams of picking up a knife and someday stabbing the hairy, smelly foreign invader's ankles as he passes by. And this is something that the United States ran into headfirst in the 1940s. And I'll end this by telling one of the many stories about my grandfather. As some of you may know, my grandfather was a veteran of World War II. He was on Normandy Beach on D-Day. He didn't have to see Saving Private Ryan to know what happened. Believe it or not, D-Day was my grandfather's first combat experience. My grandfather spent about a year in Britain preparing for the invasion that they weren't supposed to ever talk about, and they didn't know at all when it was going to happen or where exactly they were landing. Of course, that was all one of the biggest secrets in history. But they all knew it was coming eventually. Why else would they be there? Well, my grandfather survived D-Day, survived the Battle of the Bulge. The poor man grew up in Louisiana and Southeast Texas, and he told me as a kid that dealing with the winter of 1944 in Germany, which was one of the worst winters on record, it's just bad luck that it happened to happen right in the middle of World War II. My grandfather said that he had no idea that the earth could even get that cold. He didn't even know that those temperatures were possible. Once Germany surrendered, my grandfather's life became a matter of sort of babysitting prisoners and supplies that had arrived, like, for example, truckloads of boots for the war that had just ended in Europe. Unfortunately, my grandfather knew that he didn't have enough points. There was a point system. And once Germany surrendered, soldiers who had enough points for their combat experience in Europe would get to go home. Now, what happens if you didn't have enough points? Well, my grandfather was Army. He was in the Army. He was under General Patton for a while. Now, the fighting in the Pacific against the Japanese was primarily the Marine Corps. So if you were a Marine, odds are you got shipped to the Pacific. Not always, but if you were in the Army, it went the other way. However, to prepare for the invasion of the Japanese mainland, they were going to bring over the remnants of the Army to reinforce the Marines. It was expected to be far worse than D-Day. And so my grandfather is waiting around in Germany to find out whether he gets to go home or if he's going to have to survive another beachhead invasion with stiffer resistance than they saw even in France. So my grandfather told me that during the summer of 1945, while they were anxiously waiting for news, my grandfather heard a radio broadcast. A whole new kind of bomb had been dropped on Japan, and that they were simply waiting for Japan's surrender because it was a weapon that no one would be able to fight against. Now, my grandfather told me that that was the happiest day of his life, because he knew then that once Japan surrendered, he could get on a boat and go back home and marry my grandmother. And that was his plan. He's like, look, if I survive this, I'm going back home. I'm starting a family. And that's exactly what he did. I think it's fascinating that we have this bizarre, ugly intimacy with Japanese culture because of this war that happened. And you can see how my grandfather, who was an extremely charitable and gentle person inside, gruff exterior, but, what are you going to do? He was an Army guy. But he hated violence and cruelty toward anybody. And so to see someone like that get to the point where they hear about incinerating people on the other side of the world and remembering that as the happiest day of their life, that is a reflection of the time. It's a reflection of what war does to people. I can tell you, putting myself in my grandfather's position, I would have been even happier. I think, to some extent, I'm a bit of a colder person than my grandfather was. I actually think that war would have transformed me into a much less admirable person than him. That was a very unique, interesting American perspective on Japanese culture. And we will come back to the Hagakure to finish some of the more interesting passages and talk about it then. And so until then, keep your armor dusted and keep your katanas properly oiled. Remember that. Until next time.